There is a particular kind of person who spends years absorbing impact that was never theirs to absorb, softening landings that weren't their responsibility to soften, standing quietly between another person and the natural results of that person's own choices, again and again, until one day, without any dramatic announcement, they simply stop. This is the story of what happens on that day, and every day after it, not because anyone set out to punish anyone, but because the moment an empath stops absorbing the impact for someone else, that impact has nowhere left to go except exactly where it was always supposed to land in the first place. This isn't a story about revenge. It never needs to be. It's a story about what happens automatically, without any effort or cruelty on your part, the moment you stop doing a job that was never yours to do. The day the buffering stopped. For a long time you were the buffer. You didn't call it that. You called it caring, understanding, giving people the benefit of the doubt, being the kind of person who sees the wounded part underneath someone's worst behavior and responds to that wounded part instead of reacting to the behavior itself. This is, in many ways, the gift of being an empath, the capacity to feel what someone else might be carrying even when they can't articulate it, to extend patience where other people would have run out of it long ago, to hold space for someone's fear and confusion, even when that fear and confusion is actively hurting you. But there's a cost to being the buffer, one that rarely gets named clearly enough, and the cost is this. Every time you absorb the impact of someone else's avoidance, their withdrawal, their inconsistency, their inability to show up the way a relationship actually requires, you were taking on something that belonged by rights to them. You were softening a consequence that was supposed to teach a lesson, a discomfort that was supposed to prompt a change, an impact that was supposed to land somewhere and register as information. This behavior costs something. Every time you cushioned that landing with your own patience, your own explanations on their behalf, your own willingness to stay despite being treated in ways you never should have tolerated, you delayed the moment where that information could actually reach them. The day the buffering stopped wasn't a decision you announced to anyone, least of all to them. It was a quiet internal shift, the moment you finally understood that your empathy, as generous and real as it was, had been functioning as a kind of shield, protecting someone from the natural weight of their own choices, and that the shield had to come down, not out of spite, but because you finally recognized what it had been costing you to hold it up. And once it came down, everything that had been quietly, patiently waiting on the other side of it was finally free to arrive, what an empath actually absorbs. To understand what changes when the buffering stops, it helps to be specific about what an empath in this position was actually absorbing all along. It wasn't just emotional discomfort, though there was plenty of that. It was the practical, structural weight of holding a relationship together nearly single-handedly, filling in every gap the other person left, translating their silence into something more palatable, more understandable, more forgivable than silence actually deserves to be. It was doing the emotional labor of two people while receiving, in return, only intermittent scraps of the presence a real partnership requires. An empath in this position becomes remarkably skilled at explaining away behavior that would alarm almost anyone else. The withdrawal becomes they just need space. The inconsistency becomes they're working through something. The lack of accountability becomes they weren't taught how to do this differently. Every one of these explanations might contain some grain of truth, and that grain of truth is exactly what makes them so effective at keeping an empath locked into a pattern of continually extending patience. See, that isn't being met with any real effort in return. You weren't wrong to feel compassion for what shaped them. You were wrong, or at least unwise, to let that compassion function as a permanent exemption from the basic expectations any relationship requires. This is the invisible labor that empaths so often perform without ever being asked to, and without ever being thanked for it either, because the person receiving the benefit of it rarely even registers how much work is being done on their behalf. They experience the relationship as easy, low stakes, undemanding, because you are quietly absorbing every demand it would otherwise place on them. And the moment you stop absorbing it, the demand doesn't disappear. It simply becomes visible again, for what may be the first time in longer than either of you would like to admit. What breaks first is never the avoidant. Here is the part of this story that rarely gets said honestly enough. In a dynamic like this, the person who breaks first is never the one being protected. It's the person doing the protecting. An avoidant partner, insulated by your constant buffering, rarely experiences the full weight of the relationship's dysfunction because you are the one carrying it. You are the one lying awake working through the confusion. You are the one absorbing the anxious uncertainty of never quite knowing where you stand. You are the one whose nervous system pays the price for a dynamic that the other person, protected by your endless capacity to explain and forgive and adjust, barely has to feel the discomfort of it all. This is why so many empaths reach a point of genuine exhaustion, sometimes even a kind of collapse, long before the avoidant partner shows any outward sign of strain. It's not that the avoidant partner is stronger or more resilient. It's that they've been shielded by you from ever having to develop the resilience the relationship actually demands because you kept absorbing the demand yourself. You broke first because you were the one carrying the actual weight, even though you were the one who wasn't supposed to be avoiding anything at all. Recognizing this is not an invitation to bitterness. It's an invitation to clarity. If you are the one who ends up exhausted, depleted, and questioning your own worth in a dynamic where you were the more present, more communicative, more emotionally available partner, that exhaustion is not a sign that you did something wrong. It's a sign that the weight distribution in the relationship was never fair to begin with, and fairness, once you finally notice its absence, is very hard to unsee. The turning point. There tends to be a specific moment, though it doesn't always announce itself clearly at the time, when an empath stops being willing to keep absorbing impact that was never hers to absorb. Sometimes it arrives after one disappointment too many. The straw that reveals the whole structure had been unsustainable for a long time before it finally broke. Sometimes it arrives more quietly, through the slow accumulation of small realizations, until one day you notice you've simply stopped performing the emotional labor you used to perform automatically, without any conscious decision to stop at all. Whatever form it takes, the turning point marks the same essential shift. You stop being the mechanism through which someone else's avoidance gets absorbed and neutralized before it can cause any real friction. You stop explaining their behavior to yourself in ways that make it easier to tolerate. You stop translating their silence into reassurance you have to manufacture on your own. You stop extending the kind of patience that was never actually being earned, patience that had become, without your fully realizing it, a permanent exemption from the basic accountability any relationship requires. This turning point rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It often feels more like exhaustion finally winning out over hope, a quiet giving up on managing someone else's emotional responsibilities on top of your own. But its consequences are not quiet at all. The moment you stop being the buffer is simply gone, and everything it used to absorb has nowhere left to go except back to its original source. What consequences actually means. It's worth being precise about what consequences means in this context, because it's easy to imagine something more dramatic, more punitive, than what actually tends to happen. Consequences here doesn't mean orchestrated payback. It doesn't mean you doing anything at all, beyond simply stepping back from a role you should never have been playing in the first place. It means, quite literally, that reality starts to reach someone who had previously been shielded from it. A person who avoids intimacy, who withdraws under pressure, who struggles to offer consistency or accountability, experiences very different outcomes depending on whether someone else is quietly compensating for those patterns or not. With a buffer in place, the pattern can persist almost indefinitely because its costs are being paid by someone else. Without a buffer, the pattern starts to generate its own natural feedback, the kind that any behavior generates once nobody is intercepting the results on its behalf. Relationships that would have been sustained by your continued effort start to require an effort that isn't there to sustain them. Patterns that were tolerated start to be recognized by other people too, for what they actually are. None of this requires you to do anything except stop doing what you were doing before. You don't have to announce it, explain it, or engineer any particular outcome. You simply stop absorbing, and the natural consequence of a pattern finally meeting the reality it was always going to meet eventually starts to unfold on its own, the way water always eventually finds its level once nobody's hand is holding it back. Why this feels like betrayal to them and freedom to you. When an empath stops buffering, the person on the receiving end often experiences it as a kind of betrayal, a sudden and unexplained withdrawal of something they'd quietly come to depend on without ever acknowledging how much they depended on it. This reaction can be confusing because from your side, nothing has actually changed about your basic willingness to be in relationship with someone. What's changed is your willingness to keep doing labor on their behalf that was never yours to do, labor that had become so invisible to them that its absence now feels, to them, like an inexplicable shift in who you are. This dynamic is worth understanding clearly because it can otherwise trigger a familiar old guilt, the sense that you must have done something wrong if someone feels abandoned by your new boundaries. You haven't done anything wrong, You've simply stopped extending an exemption that should never have been permanent. What feels like betrayal to them is, from your side, simply the natural and overdue return of your own energy to its rightful owner, which is you. And this is where the freedom comes in, quietly and almost immediately, the moment you stop performing a role that was quietly consuming you. You are no longer responsible for managing someone else's emotional weather in addition to your own. You are no longer required to translate their behavior into something more palatable before you can tolerate it. You are simply present in your own life, unoccupied by a labor you never should have had to do, and that presence, once you feel it fully, is worth infinitely more than the exhausting, one-sided arrangement you left behind. The empath's guilt at stepping back. It would be dishonest to pretend that stepping back from this role happens without guilt, because for most empaths, guilt is one of the loudest voices in the room the moment they start considering it. You might feel guilty for no longer extending the patience you always extended before, as though patience, once given, becomes a permanent obligation rather than a gift you're allowed to stop giving when it stops being met with any reciprocity at all. You might feel guilty for the possibility that someone else will struggle without your buffering, without fully reckoning with the fact that their struggle, if it comes, is the direct and overdue result of consequences that were always theirs to face, not yours to keep absorbing indefinitely on their behalf. This guilt deserves to be examined honestly rather than simply obeyed. Ask yourself what exactly you would be guilty of no longer sacrificing your own peace to protect someone from experiences that might actually teach them something. Guilty of finally allowing a dynamic to be as difficult as it was always going to be without your constant intervention. Guilty of choosing your own well-being over an unpaid, uncompensated role you never should have volunteered for in the first place. None of this is actually something to feel guilty about, even though the feeling itself is real and worth acknowledging rather than dismissing outright. The guilt fades for most empaths not because they talk themselves out of caring, but because they start to see, over time, the actual cost of the alternative. The cost of continuing to buffer indefinitely was your own exhaustion, your own diminishment, your own slow erosion into someone smaller and more depleted than you actually are. Once that cost becomes undeniable, the guilt of stepping back starts to look, correctly, like a much smaller price to pay than the one you'd been paying all along, learning you are not responsible for every landing. One of the deepest lessons available in this entire process is the recognition that you are not responsible for softening every landing in every relationship you're part of. This runs counter to something many empaths were taught, explicitly or implicitly, from very early in life, the belief that their worth is measured by how much discomfort they can absorb on behalf of the people around them, how skillfully they can manage everyone else's feelings, how reliably they can prevent conflict, disappointment, or hardship from touching anyone they love. This belief, however well-intentioned its origins, becomes a trap in adult relationships, especially with people who struggle with consistency and accountability, because it makes you the permanent shock absorber in a dynamic that should never have required one at all. Letting go of this belief doesn't mean becoming indifferent to other people's struggles. It means recognizing the difference between compassion, which is a genuine response to someone else's pain, and buffering, which is taking on responsibility for outcomes that were never yours to control in the first place. You can feel compassion for someone's struggle with intimacy without taking personal responsibility for shielding them from its consequences. You can understand where a pattern came from without volunteering to be the person who absorbs its cost indefinitely. This distinction, once fully internalized, changes far more than just this one relationship. It changes how you show up in every future relationship, every friendship, every situation where someone else's discomfort might otherwise pull you into a role of chronic overfunctioning on their behalf. You start to ask, more instinctively, whether a given form of help is genuine support or quiet self-erasure, and that question, asked consistently enough, protects you from ever again becoming the invisible infrastructure holding up a relationship that isn't holding up its own weight. What happens to a pattern with no one absorbing it? Without speculating in detail about any particular person's inner life, it's worth naming plainly what tends to happen, in general terms, to patterns of avoidance once the people around them stop compensating for those patterns. A pattern of withdrawal that was previously tolerated because someone else kept closing the gap it left behind starts to generate its own natural friction once that gap stops being closed. Relationships that depended on someone else's continual effort to remain functional start to require an effort the avoidant person hasn't practiced supplying because they've rarely had to. People notice over time when a pattern keeps repeating across different relationships, and the explanations that used to feel sufficient start to wear thinner with repetition. None of this is punishment, and none of it requires anyone to orchestrate it. It's simply what naturally occurs when a pattern finally meets the reality it had previously been shielded from. This is worth understanding not because it should become the focus of your attention going forward, but because it can be quietly reassuring to know that stepping back from your old role doesn't mean the underlying issue simply disappears without consequence. It means the consequence, whatever form it eventually takes, becomes the responsibility of the person whose pattern actually created it, which is exactly where it always should have belonged. Your task, going forward, is not to track this outcome, not to wait for evidence of it, not to build any part of your healing around whether or not it eventually arrives. Your task is simply to keep living your own life, fully and without the old buffering labor weighing it down, and to trust that reality, left to operate without your constant intervention, is fully capable of doing the rest on its own. Reclaiming your own nervous system. There is a physical toll to constantly monitoring someone else's emotional state, anticipating their withdrawal before it happens, staying alert for the subtle shifts in tone that used to signal a coming disconnection. This kind of hypervigilance becomes so normalized over time that many empaths don't recognize it as a burden until it's gone, until they notice, often with some surprise, how much calmer their body feels once it's no longer running that constant background scan. Your nervous system was doing overtime work for a very long time, tracking someone else's inconsistency so closely that it started to feel like your own baseline state, a low hum of alertness you'd stopped even registering as unusual. Reclaiming your nervous system doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, the same way any depleted resource replenishes once the drain on it finally stops. You notice first small things, a full night of sleep that isn't interrupted by anxious replay, a meal you actually taste because your mind isn't elsewhere, running through a conversation that hasn't happened yet, bracing for one that might. A conversation with a friend where your attention stays fully present instead of splitting itself between what's being said and whatever quiet monitoring you're still doing of someone else's mood. These small returns accumulate, and eventually you find yourself living inside a body that has genuinely relaxed, not because you've stopped caring about anything, but because you've stopped carrying a specific weight that was never actually yours to carry. This physical reclamation matters as much as the emotional one, maybe more, because the body often holds onto old patterns long after the mind has consciously moved past them. Paying attention to how your body feels day to day is one of the most reliable ways to track your own healing in this process, more reliable often than any story you could tell yourself about how you think you're doing. If your shoulders have dropped, if your sleep has deepened, if your stomach has settled, these are not small things. They are the direct, physical evidence that the labor you used to perform has actually stopped, and your body, finally, has been allowed to rest. The empath who stops performing understanding. For a long time, you may have performed understanding even when you didn't fully feel it, nodding along with an explanation for behavior that, if you were being fully honest with yourself, didn't actually sit right, offering reassurance you didn't quite believe because offering it felt safer, easier, more consistent with who you'd always been than the alternative of naming your own discomfort plainly. This performance of understanding is exhausting in a way that's easy to underestimate, because it requires you to manage not just your own genuine feelings, but also the careful presentation of feelings you think will keep the peace, keep the relationship stable, keep you from being labeled difficult or unreasonable or insufficiently understanding. Stepping back from this performance is one of the quieter, less discussed parts of what changes when an empath stops buffering. You start to notice the difference between actually understanding someone and simply performing understanding on their behalf, a performance you'd gotten so skilled at that you sometimes couldn't tell the two apart anymore. You start to say more plainly when something doesn't make sense to you, when an explanation feels more like an excuse, when your own discomfort deserves to be named rather than managed quietly out of view. This isn't harshness. It's honesty, restored to a place where it had been quietly edited out for the sake of keeping things comfortable for someone else. The relief of no longer performing understanding you don't actually feel is significant, and it's worth naming clearly, because so much of what depletes an empath in these dynamics isn't the difficult feelings themselves, but the effort of constantly managing how those feelings get presented. Once you stop editing yourself for someone else's comfort, you free up an enormous amount of energy that had been quietly consumed by the performance itself. Energy that becomes available immediately for a version of you that gets to simply be honest, without translation, without softening, without the constant internal calculation of what version of your own reaction is safe to show. Rebuilding your own capacity instead of managing theirs. So much of your attention for so long was directed outward, toward managing someone else's capacity, working around their limitations, structuring your own behavior to accommodate whatever they weren't able to offer. This outward orientation, sustained long enough, tends to atrophy your own capacity in the process, not because you lost any ability, but because that ability simply wasn't being exercised, wasn't being asked to grow, because all your energy was going toward managing someone else's growth instead of your own. One of the most significant shifts that happens once you stop buffering is the redirection of that energy back toward your own development. You start asking questions about your own needs that you'd stopped asking because there was no room left after managing someone else's needs to attend to your own. You start setting goals that have nothing to do with the relationship you left behind, pursuing interests you'd let go dormant, rebuilding capacities, emotional and practical, that had been quietly neglected while you poured everything into holding up someone else's side of the structure. This rebuilding is slow, and it doesn't always feel dramatic while it's happening, but its cumulative effect is significant. You become, over time, someone with a fuller, more developed sense of her own capabilities, no longer defined by how skillfully she can manage another person's limitations, but by what she herself is actually capable of building, achieving, and becoming. This is not a small shift. It's the difference between a life organized around someone else's ceiling and a life organized around your own potential, finally given the room it needed to actually expand. What real strength looks like for an empath. There's a common misconception that strength for an empath means the capacity to endure more, to tolerate more inconsistency, to extend more patience than anyone else would be willing to extend, as though the measure of your strength is how much difficulty you can absorb without breaking. This misconception keeps a lot of empaths locked into patterns that quietly consume them, because it frames their continued endurance as a virtue rather than recognizing it, more accurately, as a slow erosion of their own well-being in service of someone who isn't reciprocating the effort. Real strength, it turns out, looks quite different than this. It looks like the willingness to stop enduring something that shouldn't require this much endurance in the first place. It looks like recognizing your own limits and honoring them, rather than treating every limit as an obstacle to be pushed through for the sake of someone else's comfort. It looks like choosing yourself, clearly and without excessive apology, even when that choice disappoints someone who had grown accustomed to your boundlessness. This redefinition of strength is one of the most important shifts available to an empath moving through this process. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can absorb and start measuring it instead by how honestly you can show up, how clearly you can name your own needs, how willing you are to protect your own peace even when doing so requires disappointing someone who benefited from your previous willingness to set that peace aside. This is a harder, more mature form of strength than simple endurance, and it's the kind that actually serves you, long after the relationship that required so much endurance has become a distant, resolved chapter in your life. The specific piece of "not my job anymore." There's a particular phrase worth returning to whenever the old instinct to manage someone else's emotional experience tries to reassert itself. Not my job anymore. It's a small phrase, almost mundane in its simplicity, but its effect, repeated often enough, is significant. It reminds you gently but firmly that you are no longer signed up for a role you never should have taken on in the first place, that whatever is happening in someone else's inner life, however difficult or confusing or in need of resolution, does not require your intervention, your explanation, or your emotional labor to work itself out. This phrase becomes especially useful in the moments when old habits try to reassert themselves, when you catch yourself starting to construct an explanation on someone else's behalf, starting to worry about how they're processing something, starting to feel responsible for smoothing over a discomfort that belongs entirely to them. In those moments, the simple, repeated reminder that this is not your job anymore can interrupt the old pattern before it fully takes hold, redirecting your attention back to your own life, your own needs, your own responsibilities, which are more than enough to occupy the energy you used to spend managing someone else's. The peace this generates is not loud or triumphant. It's quiet, almost imperceptible at first, the simple absence of a weight you'd carried for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. But over time, that quiet absence becomes one of the most valuable things in your life, a peace built not on anyone else's behavior, but on your own clear, repeated decision that certain kinds of labor are simply no longer yours to perform. Becoming discerning instead of endlessly available. One of the deepest, most valuable shifts in this whole process is the movement from endless availability to genuine discernment. For a long time, your empathy may have functioned almost indiscriminately, extended automatically to anyone who needed it, regardless of whether that person was actually capable of reciprocating care, regardless of whether the relationship was structured in a way that could ever be mutual. This indiscriminate availability felt for a long time like generosity, like a virtue worth being proud of, and in many ways it was, but it also left you vulnerable to being taken advantage of by people who had learned, consciously or not, that your empathy would always be there, regardless of how little they offered in return. Discernment changes this. It doesn't mean becoming stingy with your compassion or building walls around your capacity to care. It means learning to ask before extending yourself fully, whether the person in front of you is actually capable of meeting you partway, whether the relationship has the structural capacity for mutuality, whether your empathy is being received as a gift or simply absorbed as a resource with no expectation of return. This kind of discernment protects your empathy rather than diminishing it, ensuring that the enormous capacity you have for understanding other people gets directed toward relationships that can actually hold it, rather than being poured indefinitely into ones that can't. Learning this discernment is one of the most valuable skills to come out of this entire experience, and it will serve you for the rest of your life in every relationship you build going forward. You will still be an empath. You will still feel deeply, notice what others miss, offer a quality of understanding that not everyone is capable of. But you will offer it more wisely now, more selectively, protected by a discernment that took real difficulty to build, and that discernment will keep you from ever again pouring yourself so completely into a dynamic that was never going to pour anything back. The friends who don't understand your new boundaries. As you step into this new way of relating, not just to the person this specific relationship was about, but to everyone in your life, you may encounter some confusion or even resistance from people who got used to the old version of you, the one who was endlessly patient, endlessly available, endlessly willing to absorb whatever needed absorbing. Some friends might comment, half joking or not, that you seem different lately, less accommodating, more willing to say no, and it's worth understanding that this comment, however it's intended, is actually a description of growth, not a description of something going wrong. People who benefited from your old patterns, even in small, unconscious ways, will sometimes resist the new boundaries, not out of malice, but simply because the old version of you was easier for them to be around, required less from them, asked less accountability of them in return. This resistance doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something different, something that requires the people around you to actually show up more fully than they had to before, and not everyone will be equally comfortable making that adjustment. Let this resistance be information rather than a reason to retreat back into your old patterns. The friends and people who are genuinely glad to see you protecting your own energy, celebrating your discernment rather than missing your old boundlessness, are the ones worth keeping close. The ones who seem quietly disappointed that you're no longer as endlessly absorbing as you used to be are showing you something important about what they valued in the relationship, and that information is worth taking seriously, even when it's uncomfortable to receive. Grief for the role you used to play. It's worth acknowledging honestly that stepping out of the buffering role, even when it's the right choice, even when it brings real relief, can also bring a specific kind of grief along with it. You may miss, in an odd way, the sense of purpose that came from being needed so completely, the identity you built around being the one who understood, who held things together, who could always be counted on to absorb whatever needed absorbing. Letting go of that identity, even when it was costing you far more than it was giving you, can leave a strange kind of emptiness in its place, at least for a while. This grief is worth honoring rather than rushing past. It's not a sign that you made the wrong choice. It's a natural response to releasing a role you occupied for a long time, one that, however costly, gave your caregiving a clear direction and purpose. Grieving the loss of that role doesn't mean you want it back. It means you're human, adjusting to a significant shift in how you relate to yourself and to other people, and that adjustment takes time, even when the destination is genuinely better than where you started. What eventually replaces this grief is a different, more sustainable sense of purpose, one built not around managing someone else's limitations, but around your own growth, your own relationships with people who can actually meet you, your own life, finally centered around what you need rather than what someone else required you to provide. This new purpose takes time to fully settle in, but it arrives gradually, the same way every other part of this healing has arrived. and when it does, it feels far more solid than the old purpose ever did, because it isn't dependent on anyone else's willingness to keep needing you in order to remain intact. Redefining empathy on your own terms. Perhaps the most important work in this entire process is the redefinition of what empathy actually means to you going forward, now that you've seen firsthand what happens when it's extended without any boundary around it. Empathy was never supposed to mean self-erasure. It was never supposed to require you to absorb another person's consequences on their behalf, to explain away behavior that genuinely needed to be named honestly, to sacrifice your own well-being in service of someone else's comfort. Somewhere along the way, in this relationship, or perhaps in patterns that started long before it, empathy got tangled up with self-sacrifice, as though the depth of your compassion could only be proven by how much of yourself you were willing to give away. Redefining empathy means separating it from that tangle, understanding that you can feel deeply for someone, understand the roots of their struggles, hold genuine compassion for their pain, without that compassion requiring you to abandon your own needs in the process. Real empathy includes empathy for yourself. It includes recognizing your own limits as valid, your own needs as worthy of protection, your own well-being as something that matters just as much as anyone else's. An empathy that only ever flows outward, never inward, isn't actually complete empathy at all. It's a partial version of it, one that leaves its own source depleted and unprotected. This redefinition changes how you'll show up in every relationship going forward. You'll still feel deeply. You'll still notice what others miss, offer understanding that comes from a real and rare capacity for emotional attunement. But you'll extend that capacity now with yourself included in its scope, protected by boundaries that ensure your empathy strengthens you rather than slowly consuming you, the way it was allowed to for far too long before you finally learned to protect it properly. The body's relief. It's worth returning to the body once more, because so much of what changes in this process shows up there before it fully registers anywhere else. There is a specific quality of relief that settles into a person who has stopped performing constant emotional labor on someone else's behalf, a relief that shows up first in small, physical ways that are easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. Your jaw unclenches during the day without your noticing it was ever clenched. Your breathing deepens in moments that used to trigger a shallow, anxious kind of breath. You find yourself able to sit still, fully, without the restless undercurrent of monitoring that used to accompany even your quietest moments. This physical relief is not incidental to the emotional healing. It is in many ways the clearest evidence that the healing is real and not just a story you're telling yourself. A nervous system that has genuinely stopped bracing for someone else's inconsistency behaves differently than one that's simply trying to convince itself it's fine. It sleeps more deeply. It recovers more quickly from ordinary stress. It stops treating silence, ambiguity, or unanswered questions as automatic threats requiring vigilance, because it has learned, through repeated experience, that nothing catastrophic follows from simply letting things be uncertain without your constant management. Pay attention to this physical evidence as your healing continues. It will tell you, more honestly than your thoughts sometimes can, exactly how far you've come. A body that has relaxed this deeply after carrying this much weight for this long is not a small thing. It is proof, concrete and undeniable, that the labor has genuinely stopped and that you, finally, have been given back to yourself. What you owe yourself now. Having done this work, having stepped back from a role that was quietly consuming you for far longer than it should have been allowed to, it's worth considering what you owe yourself now, in the aftermath of this significant shift. You owe yourself patience with the parts of this transition that still feel unfamiliar, the moments when old habits try to reassert themselves, and you have to consciously choose the new pattern instead of falling automatically into the old one. You owe yourself credit for how difficult this change actually was, even though from the outside it might look like nothing more dramatic than saying no more often or explaining less on someone else's behalf. You owe yourself, too, permission to actually enjoy the life that's opening up now that you're no longer spending so much of yourself managing someone else's limitations. This permission doesn't always come naturally to empaths, who are so often more comfortable giving than receiving, more accustomed to caring for others than to simply enjoying their own unencumbered existence. But you've earned this enjoyment. You built it slowly and deliberately out of real difficulty, and it's yours now to actually live inside, not just to observe from a cautious distance as though it might be taken away at any moment. Most of all, you owe yourself the recognition that this entire process was an act of genuine strength, not a retreat from your own capacity for love and care. You didn't become less of an empath by protecting your empathy more carefully. You became a wiser one, a more sustainable one, someone whose compassion is finally structured in a way that can actually last, rather than one that was slowly burning through its own reserves in service of someone who never fully appreciated what it cost you to keep giving it. Why the consequences were never yours to deliver. It's worth returning one more time to the central idea underneath this entire piece, because it's easy to lose sight of amid everything else. The consequences described in this piece's title were never something you needed to deliver. You are not the instrument of anyone's reckoning. You don't need to engineer outcomes, orchestrate lessons, or make sure someone eventually understands the impact of their patterns. Your only task was to stop absorbing that impact yourself, and the natural consequences that follow from that simple withdrawal are not something you're responsible for producing or managing. They simply happen the way anything happens once the artificial barrier holding it back is finally removed. This distinction matters because it frees you from a subtle trap that can otherwise keep you tethered to the outcome, watching for evidence that consequences have arrived, measuring your own peace against whether reality has caught up to someone else yet. You don't need any of that. Your peace was never supposed to depend on witnessing anyone else's reckoning. It depends entirely on your own withdrawal from a role that was consuming you, a withdrawal that is already complete, already working, regardless of what you do or don't ever learn about its downstream effects. Let this be the final release. You don't need to watch for consequences. You don't need to track them, hope for them, or build your own sense of vindication around them. You already did the only part that was ever actually yours to do. What happens next belongs entirely to someone else's life, unfolding according to its own logic, while yours, finally, unfolds according to its own. Learning to receive, not just to give. One of the quieter transformations available to an empath who has stepped back from chronic overgiving is the rediscovery of what it feels like to actually receive care from someone else, rather than always being the one providing it. For a long time, your role in most relationships may have skewed heavily toward giving, offering understanding, support, patience, and emotional labor far more often than you received any of it in return. This imbalance can become so normalized that receiving genuine care from someone else starts to feel unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, a role you're not quite used to occupying. Learning to receive is its own kind of healing, separate from but connected to everything else described in this piece. It means allowing yourself to be comforted without immediately deflecting the comfort back toward reassuring the person offering it. It means letting a friend take care of you during a hard week without rushing to make sure you're not being a burden. It means eventually allowing a future partner to show up for you consistently, to meet your needs without your having to ask twice, to offer the kind of steady presence you spent so long offering to someone who couldn't or wouldn't offer it back. This capacity to receive doesn't develop overnight, especially for someone whose identity has been built so heavily around giving. But it develops gradually, the same way every other part of this transformation has developed, through repeated small experiences of allowing yourself to be cared for and noticing, each time, that nothing bad happens when you do. Eventually, receiving becomes as natural as giving always was, and a relationship built around mutual giving and receiving, rather than your endless output and someone else's endless intake, becomes not just possible but genuinely expected, the new baseline you build every future connection around. What this means for the relationships you build next. Everything you've learned in this process will shape whoever comes into your life next, whether as a friend, a partner, or any other significant connection. You will bring to those relationships a far sharper instinct for imbalance, a quicker recognition of the early signs that you're being asked to buffer more than your fair share, a willingness to name that imbalance early rather than absorbing it silently for months or years the way you might have before. This isn't cynicism about future relationships. It's wisdom, hard-won and specific, that will make every future connection healthier precisely because you're no longer willing to carry more than your half of it. You will also bring a clearer sense of what mutuality actually looks like, built out of direct comparison to what its absence felt like. You'll recognize more quickly than before the difference between someone who meets your empathy with their own effort and someone who simply absorbs it without ever reciprocating. This recognition will save you enormous amounts of time and energy going forward, protecting you from investing deeply in dynamics that were never going to become mutual, no matter how much patience you extended. Most importantly, you'll bring a self that has already proven, through direct and difficult experience, that she is capable of protecting her own well-being even when doing so is hard, even when it disappoints someone, even when it requires tolerating guilt and grief along the way. that proof doesn't disappear once this particular chapter closes. It becomes part of who you are, a permanent resource you carry into every future relationship, ensuring that you never again slide, unknowingly, into a role of chronic overgiving that costs you as much as this one did. The empath's real power. If there is a single truth worth taking from this entire piece, let it be this. An empath's real power was never in how much she could endure, how completely she could absorb someone else's dysfunction, how endlessly she could extend patience to someone who wasn't meeting her halfway. That was never power. That was depletion dressed up in the language of virtue, mistaken for strength because it required so much visible effort to sustain. Real power for an empath looks like discernment. It looks like boundaries. It looks like the willingness to step back from a role that was consuming her, even when stepping back feels unfamiliar, even when it disappoints someone who benefited from her boundlessness. It looks like redirecting an enormous, genuine capacity for compassion toward relationships that can actually hold it, rather than pouring it indefinitely into ones that can't. This is a harder, more mature form of power than simple endurance, and it's the kind that actually serves you, protects you, and allows your empathy to remain a gift rather than slowly becoming a wound. You have this power now, fully available to you, built out of everything this experience taught you. Use it wisely. Extend your empathy generously, but never again without boundary, never again without discernment, never again in a way that requires you to disappear in order for someone else to remain comfortable. This is what it means to never let your empathy be broken again, not because you built walls around your heart, but because you finally learned exactly how to protect the very thing that makes your heart so valuable in the first place. The myth of the empath who fixes everyone. There is a persistent myth, especially popular in certain corners of self-help culture, that an empath's purpose is to fix the broken people who cross her path, to be the one person patient enough, insightful enough, loving enough to finally reach someone who couldn't be reached by anyone else before. This myth is seductive because it flatters a real capacity, the genuine gift of emotional attunement many empaths carry, and turns that gift into a kind of mission, a calling, something that makes chronic self-sacrifice feel meaningful rather than simply costly. The truth is less romantic and more useful. You cannot fix another person's capacity for intimacy through sheer patience and understanding. You cannot love someone into consistency if consistency requires internal work only they can do. You cannot be so perfectly attuned, so endlessly generous, so skillfully non-threatening that someone who struggles with closeness suddenly finds closeness easy in your presence alone. This isn't a failure of your empathy. It's simply the limit of what empathy, however deep, can actually accomplish when it's directed at someone else's internal work rather than your own. Letting go of the fixing myth is one of the more liberating shifts available in this process. It releases you from an impossible task you never should have taken on, and it redirects your very real gifts toward relationships where they can actually make a difference. Relationships with people who are doing their own work alongside you, meeting your effort with their own, rather than waiting passively for your empathy to somehow do the work for both of you. Your empathy was never supposed to be a repair tool for someone else's unfinished growth. It was supposed to be a gift you share with people capable of receiving and returning it, and recognizing that distinction is one of the most protective pieces of wisdom you can carry forward. Sitting with the discomfort of no longer explaining. For a long time, explaining other people's behavior to yourself and often to others was a reflex so automatic you probably didn't notice how much energy it required. Someone canceled plans again, and you found yourself constructing a reason before anyone even asked you to. Someone went quiet for days, and you filled the silence with your own generous interpretation, sparing yourself the discomfort of sitting with an unexplained absence by simply inventing an explanation that made it easier to bear. This reflex, while understandable, kept you constantly occupied with a kind of narrative labor that wasn't actually yours to perform. Stepping back from this reflex means learning to sit with discomfort you used to immediately resolve through explanation. It means allowing a silence to simply be a silence, without needing to fill it with a story that makes it easier to tolerate. It means letting someone's behavior simply be confusing sometimes, without your mind rushing in to manufacture clarity that isn't actually available yet. This is uncomfortable at first because your mind has spent so long being the place where confusing behavior gets processed into something manageable, and giving up that role can feel, initially, like giving up control. But there is real freedom on the other side of this discomfort. You start to notice how much energy you'd been spending on explanations that were never verified, never confirmed, sometimes entirely invented out of a desire to make an uncomfortable situation feel more bearable. Letting go of the need to explain everything immediately frees that energy for something more useful, simply observing what's actually happening, without editorializing it into something softer than it really is, and trusting your own direct perception over a story constructed to make discomfort easier to swallow. The difference between compassion and complicity. It's worth drawing a clear line here between genuine compassion, which remains a real and valuable part of who you are, and complicity, which is what compassion becomes when it's extended without any accompanying boundary or expectation of change. Compassion says, I understand where this behavior might come from, and I can hold space for the pain underneath it. Complicity says, because I understand where this behavior comes from, I will continue to accept it indefinitely, regardless of how it affects me, regardless of whether any change is ever attempted in response to my understanding. This line is easy to blur, especially for an empath whose natural instinct is to understand deeply and forgive generously, but the blurring has real costs. When compassion slides into complicity, you end up in relationships where your understanding becomes a substitute for accountability rather than a companion to it, where the depth of your empathy inadvertently removes any incentive for the other person to change, because your understanding alone is enough to keep the relationship intact regardless of whether their behavior ever shifts. Holding this line clearly going forward means you can continue to offer genuine compassion, understanding the roots of someone's struggle, feeling real empathy for what shaped them, without that compassion translating automatically into acceptance of behavior that hurts you. You can understand someone fully and still hold them accountable for the impact of their choices. These two things were never actually in tension, even though the confusion between them kept you trapped in patterns of tolerance for far longer than those patterns deserved to be tolerated. What happens to your time now? It's worth taking a very literal look at what happens to your actual time, hour by hour, once it's no longer being consumed by the labor of managing someone else's emotional landscape. Time you used to spend crafting careful messages, trying to find exactly the right words that wouldn't trigger withdrawal, is now simply available, unoccupied, yours to spend however you choose. Time you used to spend processing confusing interactions with friends, working through what someone's behavior might have meant, is now free for conversations about things that actually interest you, rather than conversations that exist primarily to help you make sense of someone else's inconsistency. This reclaimed time adds up to something significant when you actually total it. Hours that used to disappear into anxious analysis are now available for hobbies you'd let go dormant. Evenings that used to be shaped around managing your own reactions to someone else's unpredictability are now shaped by whatever you actually want to do with them. Weekends that used to include an undercurrent of monitoring, wondering, waiting, are now simply weekends, full and unshadowed by a background task you'd stopped even noticing you were running. Take stock of this reclaimed time honestly, because it's one of the most concrete, measurable outcomes of everything described in this piece. You are not just emotionally freer now. You are literally, practically freer, with actual hours and days returned to you that used to be quietly consumed by a role you never should have had to play in the first place. What you build with that reclaimed time is entirely up to you now, unburdened by the old demands that used to claim so much of it before you ever got the chance to spend it on yourself. The empath who learns to walk away before the breaking point. Perhaps the most important skill to carry forward from this entire experience is the ability to recognize the early signs of an unsustainable dynamic and step back before you reach the point of total depletion that characterized this particular chapter. For a long time, your instinct was to stay, to keep trying, to keep extending patience well past the point where patience was actually serving you or the relationship, because leaving felt like giving up, and giving up felt inconsistent with who you believed yourself to be. Learning to walk away earlier, before reaching total exhaustion, is not giving up. It's wisdom, the direct product of having lived through what happens when you don't, when you stay until you're genuinely depleted, until your own well-being has been sacrificed so completely that recovery takes months or years to fully complete. You now carry the knowledge of exactly what that depletion feels like, and that knowledge becomes a kind of early warning system, alerting you far sooner in any future relationship to the signs that you're beginning to slide back into the same unsustainable pattern. This early recognition is a gift, even though it was purchased at real cost. You don't have to wait for total collapse anymore to know when a dynamic isn't working. You can notice the early warning signs, the growing pattern of one-sided effort, the recurring sense of managing someone else's emotional labor on top of your own, and you can act on that recognition immediately, protecting yourself long before the situation ever approaches the kind of depletion you experienced this time. This is what real growth looks like, not never facing difficulty again, but facing it with far more self-protective wisdom than you had access to before. Trusting the version of you who chose to stop. There will be moments, even well into this healing, when a small doubt resurfaces, a quiet wondering whether you gave up too soon, whether you should have kept trying a little longer, whether the version of you who finally stopped absorbing all that impact was being too harsh, too quick to withdraw something she used to offer so freely. These doubts are worth examining honestly rather than simply obeying, because they often carry the residue of old patterns, old beliefs about what a good, caring person is supposed to tolerate indefinitely. Trust the version of you who chose to stop. She wasn't acting rashly. She was acting out of an accumulation of real evidence, gathered patiently over a long period of time, that the effort she was extending wasn't being met with anything close to reciprocity. She made her choice not out of impulsiveness, but out of exhaustion that had built, layer by layer, until continuing simply wasn't sustainable anymore. That choice deserves your trust, not your second guessing, because it was made by a version of you who had far more direct information about the actual state of the relationship than any retrospective doubt could ever have access to now. This trust in your own past decisions becomes one of the sturdier foundations of your ongoing healing. Every time an old doubt surfaces, you can return to this trust, reminding yourself that the choice to stop was not a failure of patience or generosity, but the natural, overdue result of patience and generosity finally meeting their limit. That limit was real. It deserved to be honored. And the version of you who honored it deserves your gratitude, not your suspicion, for finally protecting something that had been left unprotected for far too long. What empathy looks like when it's finally protected. Picture for a moment what your empathy actually looks like now that it's protected by everything you've learned, rather than left exposed the way it used to be. It's still deep. It's still capable of understanding people in ways that many others simply can't. It still notices what's unspoken, feels what others are carrying even when they haven't said a word about it, offers a quality of presence that remains genuinely rare and valuable. None of that has diminished. What's changed is the container it lives inside now. A container built out of boundaries, discernment, and self-respect, ensuring that this remarkable capacity gets directed toward people and situations that can actually receive it well, rather than being poured indiscriminately into anyone who happens to need it, regardless of whether they're capable of honoring what they're being given. This protected empathy is more valuable, not less, than the unprotected version you carried before. It's sustainable now, in a way it wasn't before, capable of lasting for the rest of your life rather than slowly burning itself out in service of people who never fully appreciated its cost. It shows up more powerfully in the relationships that deserve it, precisely because it's no longer being diluted across dynamics that were only ever going to consume it without giving anything back. This is what it looks like to never let your empathy be broken again, not by hardening it, not by withdrawing it, but by finally learning to protect it the way any valuable, finite resource deserves to be protected. You still have everything that made you an empath in the first place. You've simply learned at real cost exactly how to keep that gift intact for the people and the life that actually deserve to receive it. The quiet confidence that comes from this. There's a specific kind of confidence available only to people who have lived through the process this piece describes, who have gone from chronic overgiving to genuine self-protection, and come out the other side still capable of love, still capable of connection, but no longer willing to sacrifice themselves in the process. This confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself or prove itself to anyone. It simply exists quietly as a kind of settled knowledge that you are capable of recognizing an unsustainable dynamic and stepping back from it, that you don't have to wait until total depletion to protect yourself, that your own well-being is something you now know how to defend, even against the pull of your own generous instincts. This confidence shows up in how you enter new relationships now, with a groundedness that wasn't available to you before this experience. You're not naive about the possibility of imbalance recurring, and you're not cynical about the possibility of genuine mutuality either. You simply carry a clear-eyed awareness of what healthy reciprocity looks like, built out of direct comparison to its absence, and that awareness protects you without requiring you to become guarded or distrustful in a way that would prevent real connection from forming. You built this confidence the hard way, through actual experience rather than reassurance, and that's exactly what makes it durable. It doesn't depend on this particular chapter remaining relevant to your life. It has become simply part of who you are now, a permanent asset you carry forward into everything that comes next, protecting you not through walls or withdrawal, but through a clear, hard-won understanding of exactly what you deserve and exactly what you're no longer willing to accept less than. Why this story was always about you. If there's one thing worth restating clearly before this piece closes, it's that this entire story, despite its title, was never actually about the avoidant person at its center. It was always about you, about the process of finally recognizing a pattern that was consuming you, about the difficult, courageous work of stepping back from a role you never should have had to occupy, about rebuilding a life and an identity that no longer depends on how much impact you're willing to absorb on someone else's behalf. Whatever consequences eventually arrive for someone whose patterns finally meet reality without your buffering, those consequences were always a side effect of your own healing, never its actual purpose. This matters because it protects you from making your continued peace contingent on watching those consequences unfold, from checking for evidence, from needing to see proof that stepping back mattered in order to feel confident that it did. It mattered. It matters because of what it did for you, not because of what it might eventually do to anyone else. Your healing is complete or well on its way to being complete, regardless of what happens next in someone else's life, because your healing was never actually dependent on their story to begin with. Let this be the final, clarifying truth underneath everything else described here. You are not the instrument of anyone's reckoning, and you don't need to be. You are simply someone who finally learned to stop absorbing what was never yours to absorb, and in doing so, you gave yourself back to yourself fully, completely, and for good. That gift, the one you gave to yourself, is the entire point of this story, and it always was. The empath's new relationship with silence. Silence used to be one of the most loaded, uncomfortable spaces in your life, a place where your mind rushed to fill in explanations, where anxiety tended to expand to fill whatever room the quiet gave it. An unanswered message, an unusual pause in conversation, a stretch of days without contact, all of it used to trigger a particular kind of internal scramble, a need to resolve the discomfort of not knowing by generating some story, however speculative, that would make the silence feel more bearable. One of the deeper transformations available in this process is a genuinely different relationship with silence itself, not just in relation to any one specific person, but as a general capacity that carries forward into every part of your life. Silence starts to feel less like a threat requiring immediate resolution and more like simply what it is: an absence of information, neutral until proven otherwise, not automatically dangerous just because it's unexplained. You start to notice that you can sit inside an unanswered question without needing to answer it prematurely, that not knowing something doesn't have to feel like an emergency, that your peace doesn't actually require constant clarity about everyone else's intentions or state of mind. This new relationship with silence extends far beyond any single relationship. It changes how you handle uncertainty at work, in friendships, in every part of life where ambiguity used to trigger an anxious need for resolution. You become, gradually, someone who can tolerate not knowing, someone whose peace doesn't depend on having every question answered immediately, and that tolerance turns out to be one of the more valuable, transferable skills to come out of this entire difficult process. What you no longer perform for approval. For a long time, a certain amount of your behavior in this relationship and probably in others was shaped by an unspoken hope for approval, a desire to be seen as understanding, patient, easy to be with, generous in ways that would eventually be recognized and appreciated. This performance wasn't dishonest exactly, because the underlying qualities were genuinely part of who you are, but it was shaped, at least partly, by a hope that if you performed them well enough, consistently enough, you would eventually receive the kind of consistent care and appreciation you were hoping for in return. Stepping back from chronic overgiving includes stepping back from this performance as well. You stop shaping your behavior around what might earn approval and start shaping it, instead, around what actually feels true and sustainable for you. This might mean being less immediately accommodating, less automatically patient, less willing to smooth over friction just to maintain an image of yourself as endlessly easygoing. It might mean disappointing someone's expectation of you, built up over years of your consistent overperformance, in favor of a version of yourself that's more honest, even if less immediately pleasing. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if approval seeking has been a long-standing pattern that predates this particular relationship entirely. But the discomfort fades as you discover that the approval you were performing for was never actually as valuable as the authenticity you gave up to earn it. Being genuinely yourself, unshaped by a hope for approval that was never reliably forthcoming anyway, turns out to be far more satisfying than any amount of appreciation you might have received for a performance that was slowly costing you your actual self in the process of maintaining it. The value of being difficult to manipulate. There's a specific kind of value in becoming someone who is genuinely difficult to manipulate, not through suspicion or coldness, but through the simple fact of having clear boundaries and a strong enough sense of self that old tactics, whatever they once were, simply don't have the same purchase on you anymore. This isn't about becoming hardened or cynical. It's about becoming someone whose sense of worth doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's approval or disapproval, whose peace doesn't depend on someone else's mood, whose decisions are grounded in her own values rather than in a hope of managing someone else's reaction to them. This kind of resilience develops naturally out of everything described throughout this piece. As you rebuild trust in your own perception, as you learn to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it through explanation or accommodation, as you develop genuine discernment about who deserves your empathy and who doesn't, you become, gradually, someone who is simply harder to pull back into old patterns, regardless of what tactics might be employed to try. This isn't a wall. It's groundedness, the natural result of having done real internal work rather than simply deciding, superficially, to be more guarded. Being difficult to manipulate is one of the most valuable protective qualities you can develop, not just in relation to this one relationship, but in every future situation where someone might try to exploit your empathy, your patience, or your desire to see the good in people. You haven't lost your capacity to see the good in people. You've simply gained the wisdom to see it alongside everything else that's actually true, and that fuller vision protects you in ways your old, more singular focus on the good never could, standing in the life you rebuilt. Take a moment now to actually stand inside the life you've rebuilt through everything described in this piece, rather than rushing past it toward whatever comes next. This life is quieter than the one you left behind, not because it's smaller, but because it's no longer filled with the constant background noise of managing someone else's emotional landscape. It's fuller in the ways that actually matter, full of your own goals, your own friendships, your own developing sense of who you are outside of a role built entirely around absorbing someone else's dysfunction. This life didn't build itself. You built it deliberately through a long series of difficult choices, moments of doubt you pushed through, grief you allowed yourself to feel without letting it pull you backward, guilt you examined honestly and ultimately set down. Every part of this life reflects the work you did to get here, and it deserves to be recognized as your accomplishment, not simply as the passive result of time passing or circumstances changing on their own. Stand in it fully. Let yourself feel the specific satisfaction of having built something real out of something that once felt impossibly difficult. Whatever comes next, whoever enters your life, whatever new chapters unfold from here, they'll all be built on this foundation, this proof you've already generated that you are capable of protecting yourself, rebuilding yourself, and choosing yourself consistently, even when it's hard. That proof is yours now permanently, and it will serve you for the rest of your life. Closing, what never breaking again actually means. The title of this piece promises something about never breaking, about protecting an empath's capacity for love from ever being exploited or exhausted the same way again, and it's worth being precise at the end about what that promise actually means in practice. It doesn't mean you'll never feel deeply again, never extend compassion again, never risk caring about someone who might not fully deserve it. It means you now carry the tools to recognize, far sooner than before, when your empathy is being extended without reciprocity, when a dynamic is asking you to absorb more than your fair share, when the cost of your caring has started to outweigh what it's actually accomplishing. Never breaking again doesn't mean never being tested again. It means having the discernment, the boundaries, and the self-respect to step back from a test you recognize as unsustainable, long before it reaches the point of total depletion this particular chapter required to finally teach you its lesson. You'll still love deeply. You'll still be moved by other people's pain, still offer understanding that not everyone else is capable of offering. But you'll do it now with your own well-being built firmly into the equation, protected by everything this experience taught you, no longer willing to disappear in order to make someone else's comfort possible. This is what it means to never let an empath be broken again, not the absence of future difficulty, but the presence of enough hard-won wisdom to meet that difficulty differently than you met this one. You have that wisdom now. It's yours, permanently built out of real cost, but worth every bit of what it took to earn it, and it will carry you, protected and whole, into every chapter of your life that comes after this one. The difference between withdrawal and growth. It's worth being careful in this process to distinguish between two things that can look similar from the outside, but come from very different places internally. Withdrawal born of bitterness and growth born of genuine self-respect. Withdrawal born of bitterness closes you off entirely, teaches you to distrust every new person based on the failures of one relationship, keeps you guarded in a way that prevents real connection from ever forming again. This kind of withdrawal, while understandable as a temporary reaction to real pain, isn't actually healing. It's protection purchased at the cost of your future capacity for closeness, and it tends to leave people feeling more isolated over time, not less burdened. Growth born of genuine self-respect looks different, even though it involves some of the same behaviors on the surface: less automatic accommodation, clearer boundaries, more discernment about who earns your trust. The difference is internal. Growth doesn't close you off from connection. It refines your approach to connection, ensuring that the openness you still carry gets directed toward people and situations capable of receiving it well. You remain capable of trust, of vulnerability, of real intimacy, but you extend these things more thoughtfully now, informed by real experience rather than blocked entirely by fear of repeating it. Checking in with yourself periodically about which of these two paths you're actually on is worth doing honestly. If you notice yourself assuming the worst about every new person before they've given you any reason to, if you notice a general hardness settling in that prevents you from feeling much of anything toward anyone, that's worth examining as a sign that bitterness might be masquerading as growth. But if you notice yourself still capable of warmth, still open to connection, simply more discerning about where you extend it, that's the real thing, the version of this transformation that actually serves your long-term well-being rather than simply protecting you at the cost of everything else. What it means to finally believe you deserve reciprocity. Underneath so much of what's been described in this piece is a single, foundational belief that had to shift before any of the rest of it became possible. The belief that you actually deserve reciprocity, that a relationship is supposed to involve two people showing up for each other roughly equally, rather than one person doing the vast majority of the emotional work while the other simply receives it. This belief sounds obvious when stated plainly, but for many empaths it isn't obvious at all. It has to be relearned, sometimes painstakingly, after years of relationships, romantic or otherwise, where an imbalance felt normal simply because it was familiar. Believing you deserve reciprocity changes everything about how you engage with new relationships going forward. It means you stop accepting, as a baseline, dynamics where you're doing significantly more of the emotional labor than the other person. It means you start noticing, much earlier than before, when a relationship is asking you to carry more than your fair share, and you start naming that imbalance rather than quietly absorbing it the way you might have before. This belief doesn't make you demanding or difficult. It makes you accurate, finally aligned with a truth that should have been obvious all along. You are exactly as deserving of care, consistency, and effort as anyone you've ever extended those things to. This shift in belief is, in many ways, the true engine behind everything else described in this piece. The boundaries, the discernment, the willingness to step back from unsustainable patterns, none of it would have been possible without this underlying belief finally taking root. Once you believe, fully and without exception, that you deserve reciprocity, protecting yourself from its absence stops feeling like an act of selfishness and starts feeling like the most natural thing in the world. Honoring the empath you were before this. Before this specific chapter, before the exhaustion of chronic overgiving fully set in, there was a version of you who approached the world with an open, generous heart, unguarded and genuinely hopeful about what connection could offer. It's worth honoring that version of yourself too, not just the version who eventually learned to protect herself, because that earlier openness was never actually the problem. The problem was never that you cared too much. The problem was that you cared without adequate protection, extending real generosity into a dynamic that wasn't equipped to honor it. Nothing about this healing process requires you to reject that earlier, more unguarded version of yourself. She was not naive for caring deeply. She was simply inexperienced in a way that everyone starts out inexperienced before life teaches them, sometimes at real cost, exactly how to protect the things that matter most to them. You don't have to look back at her with embarrassment or regret. You can look back at her with tenderness, recognizing that her openness, however costly it eventually became, was never actually a flaw. It was a real and valuable capacity that simply needed better boundaries around it in order to be sustainable. This honoring matters because it keeps you from swinging too far in the other direction, from rejecting your own natural generosity as though it were the root problem rather than simply an underprotected version of a genuine strength. The goal was never to become less generous. It was to become generous more wisely, protected now by everything you've learned, but still fundamentally the same person underneath, the one who feels deeply, cares genuinely, and has so much real love to offer, finally offering it now to people and situations capable of receiving it well. What happens when you stop auditioning for consistency? For a long time, without fully realizing it, you may have been auditioning, in a sense, for consistency you never actually received, hoping that if you were patient enough, understanding enough, low maintenance enough, you would eventually earn the kind of steady presence that other people seem to get without having to work nearly as hard. This auditioning is exhausting precisely because it never actually pays off the way it's designed to in your mind. Consistency isn't something you can earn through enough patience or enough accommodation. It's something a person either offers freely, as part of who they are, or doesn't, regardless of how skillfully you perform your own worthiness of receiving it. Stepping back from this audition is one of the more freeing parts of this entire process. You stop trying to prove that you deserve steady presence and start simply expecting it, as a basic requirement of any relationship you're going to invest in, rather than a prize to be won through sufficient patience. This shift changes how you evaluate new relationships from the very beginning. Instead of asking whether you can earn someone's consistency through your own effort, you start asking whether consistency is already present, naturally, without your having to work for it at all. This is a significant recalibration, and it protects you from ever again investing years of effort into auditioning for something that should have simply been offered from the start. Consistency, real consistency, doesn't require an audition. It's present or it isn't, and once you internalize this fully, you stop wasting your considerable capacity for patience and understanding on relationships that were only ever going to keep you auditioning indefinitely, without ever actually delivering the role you were hoping to finally earn. The freedom of no longer needing to be chosen. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives once you stop needing to be chosen by someone who has already shown you, through their patterns, that choosing you consistently isn't something they're capable of or willing to do. For a long time, some part of you may have been oriented around earning that choice, proving your worth through endless patience and understanding, hoping that eventually, if you just gave enough, you would finally be chosen in the way you deserved to be chosen from the very beginning. Letting go of this need doesn't mean you stop wanting to be chosen by the people in your life. It means you stop needing it from someone specific who has already demonstrated an inability to offer it, and you redirect that need toward people and situations actually capable of meeting it. This redirection is one of the most liberating shifts available in this process, because it releases you from an exhausting, ultimately fruitless campaign to win over someone whose capacity for consistent choosing simply wasn't there to begin with, no matter how deserving you were of receiving it. Once this need is redirected, you start to notice how many people in your life are actually capable of choosing you consistently, reliably, without your having to earn it through exhausting effort. Friends who show up without being asked, family members who offer steady presence without requiring performance from you first. Eventually, if and when you're ready, a partner who chooses you easily, repeatedly, without the constant uncertainty that characterized the relationship this piece has been describing throughout. This is what being chosen is actually supposed to feel like, and once you experience it, you'll understand exactly how much you were settling for before, without ever fully realizing it. A final reflection on strength. Strength throughout this entire piece has been redefined again and again, moving away from the idea that strength means enduring more, absorbing more, tolerating more, and toward a fuller, more accurate understanding. Strength means protecting what matters, including yourself, even when protection requires disappointing someone, even when it requires grieving a role you used to occupy, even when it requires tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty rather than rushing to resolve it through your own labor. This redefinition is, in many ways, the true gift underneath everything else described here. You are stronger now not because you've become harder or less capable of feeling deeply, but because you've learned to direct your considerable capacity for care toward relationships and situations that can actually hold it, protected by boundaries you didn't used to have, guided by a discernment you had to build the hard way. This strength will serve you for the rest of your life, in every relationship you build going forward, in every situation where your natural generosity might otherwise be exploited by someone unwilling or unable to meet you halfway. Carry this strength forward with the confidence it deserves. You built it through real difficulty, through a process that asked more of you than you probably expected it to when it began. And you met that demand fully, emerging on the other side of it not as someone diminished by what happened, but as someone genuinely, permanently strengthened by having survived it, and more importantly, by having learned exactly what it takes to never let it happen again. When someone tries to draw you back in, even after this transformation is well underway, there may come a moment when the person at the center of this dynamic tries in some form to draw you back into your old role, whether through a message after a long silence, an attempt to explain themselves that arrives only once they sense your withdrawal, or some other gesture designed, consciously or not, to reactivate the buffering you used to provide so reliably. These moments can be disorienting, especially if they arrive after you've built real distance and started to feel genuinely settled in your new way of relating. It helps to recognize these moments for what they are, not necessarily evidence of genuine change, but often a response to the discomfort of losing something they'd grown accustomed to having available, even if they never fully appreciated what it cost you to provide it. This recognition doesn't require you to assume the worst about their intentions. It simply means holding a healthy skepticism about whether a single gesture, arriving only once your withdrawal became noticeable, reflects a genuine shift in their capacity for consistency, or simply a response to losing access to something convenient. Whatever the intention behind it, you get to decide, clearly and without excessive deliberation, whether to re-engage with the old pattern or hold the boundary you've worked so hard to build. This decision doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as noticing the old pull, acknowledging it, and choosing, once again, not to follow it. Each time you make this choice, the pull grows a little weaker, and eventually these moments stop having any real power over you at all, becoming simply one more piece of evidence that the boundary you built is solid, tested, and genuinely holding. The empath's relationship with hope. Hope played a complicated role throughout the original relationship this piece has been describing, both a genuine source of resilience and, at times, a trap that kept you invested in a dynamic long past the point where investment made sense. Hope that things would improve, that consistency would eventually arrive, that patience would eventually be rewarded, kept you engaged during periods when disengaging might have actually served you better. This isn't a criticism of hope itself, which is a genuinely valuable capacity, but an honest acknowledgement that hope, unchecked by any evidence requirement, can become its own kind of trap. Part of this healing process involves developing a more discerning relationship with hope, one that doesn't abandon the capacity for optimism entirely but that pairs it, going forward, with a clearer requirement for evidence. Hope, in this more mature form, doesn't mean assuming the best about someone regardless of their actual behavior. It means remaining open to genuine change while requiring that change to actually show up in consistent action, rather than simply in promises, explanations, or your own generous interpretation of ambiguous signals. This recalibrated hope serves you far better going forward than the unchecked version did. You remain capable of believing in people, of extending trust to those who earn it, of hoping for good outcomes in your relationships and your life more broadly. But you no longer extend hope indefinitely, without any requirement that it be met by actual evidence, and this small but significant shift protects you from ever again investing years of your life in a hope that was never actually being fed by anything real. The practical wisdom you carry forward. Beyond the emotional and psychological shifts described throughout this piece, there's a body of practical wisdom you now carry forward, concrete lessons that will shape how you navigate every future relationship, romantic or otherwise. You now know what chronic imbalance feels like from the inside, which means you'll recognize it far more quickly the next time it starts to develop, rather than only realizing its full extent years into a pattern. You now know the specific signs that indicate you're beginning to overfunction on someone else's behalf, explaining their behavior before they've explained it themselves, managing their reactions before they've had them, absorbing discomfort that was never actually yours to absorb. You also now know what genuine reciprocity actually feels like, or at least what its absence felt like clearly enough to recognize the difference when reciprocity finally does show up in a future relationship. This comparison point is invaluable because it means you're no longer operating purely on hope or theory about what a healthy relationship should feel like. You have direct, lived experience of the alternative, and that experience makes you far better equipped to recognize health when you finally encounter it. This practical wisdom is, in many ways, the most durable outcome of everything described in this piece. Feelings fade and shift over time, but practical knowledge, embedded through direct experience, tends to stay with you permanently, informing your decisions in ways you might not even consciously notice anymore. You are quite simply a wiser person now than you were before this chapter began, equipped with knowledge that took real difficulty to earn, but that will serve you, reliably, for the rest of your life. What this chapter taught you about yourself. Beyond everything this chapter taught you about relationships, patterns, and reciprocity, it also taught you a great deal about yourself, specifically about your own capacity to endure difficulty, to grow through it, and to emerge from it fundamentally stronger rather than diminished. You learned that you are capable of extending real, genuine compassion, even to someone whose capacity to receive it was limited. You learn that you are capable of recognizing, eventually, when that compassion has stopped serving you, and of stepping back from it even when doing so is difficult. You learn that you can survive the guilt, the grief, and the disorientation of significant change, and come out the other side more solid, more self-possessed, more clearly yourself than you were before any of it began. This self-knowledge is perhaps the most valuable outcome of the entire process, more valuable even than anything you learned about relationships specifically. You now know, with a certainty that only comes from direct experience, exactly what you're capable of when circumstances demand real growth from you. This knowledge will serve you far beyond this particular chapter, informing how you approach every future difficulty life presents, with a quiet confidence that you have already proven, to yourself if to no one else, that you can meet hard things and come through them intact. Carry this self-knowledge forward as one of the truest gifts to come out of everything you've been through. You are not the same person who entered this relationship. You are someone who has been tested significantly and who met that test with real courage, even on the days it didn't feel like courage at all, even on the days it just felt like exhaustion and confusion and the slow, unglamorous work of getting through one more difficult moment. That work added up to something real, and what it added up to is the stronger, wiser, more protected version of yourself standing here now. The life that's actually yours. Everything described throughout this piece points toward a single outcome. A life that is genuinely, completely yours, no longer organized around managing someone else's limitations, no longer shaped by the constant background labor of buffering someone else's impact, no longer measured by how much you can endure on behalf of a relationship that was never structured to hold up its own weight. This life is quieter in some ways than the one you left behind, but it's fuller in every way that actually matters, populated by relationships that can hold genuine reciprocity, filled with time and energy that belong entirely to you, grounded in a self-respect that took real difficulty to build, but that now feels as natural and permanent as anything else about who you are. This is the life that was always meant to be yours, the one that existed underneath all the labor you were performing on someone else's behalf, waiting patiently for you to finally set that labor down and discover what remained once it was gone. What remained was you, whole and capable and deeply, genuinely worthy of the reciprocity you now know how to expect and protect. That version of you was always there. It just took this entire difficult process to finally clear enough space for her to be fully visible again, unobscured by a role that was never actually hers to play. Stand fully inside this life now. It's real, it's earned, and it's entirely yours, built out of every difficult choice described throughout this piece, every moment of doubt you pushed through, every boundary you held even when holding it was hard. You did this. Nobody else could have done it for you, and nobody else did. And now finally you get to simply live inside what you built, protected, whole, and completely, unmistakably your own. What you no longer owe an explanation for. There was a time when nearly every boundary you tried to set came with an accompanying explanation, a justification, a careful accounting of exactly why you needed the space or the distance or the change you were asking for, as though your own discomfort wasn't reason enough on its own to warrant respect. This habit of over-explaining is common among empaths, who often assume that their needs will only be honored if they're presented alongside a sufficiently compelling case, as though the other person's willingness to respect a boundary depends entirely on how well that boundary has been argued for. Part of what changes in this process is a growing recognition that you don't actually owe anyone an exhaustive explanation for protecting your own peace. You can say simply that something isn't working for you without providing a full itemized account of every reason why. You can decline to engage further with a dynamic that's draining you without first proving to the other person's satisfaction that your exhaustion is legitimate. Your own experience of depletion is sufficient justification on its own. It doesn't require external validation to be real, and it doesn't require a persuasive argument to be honored. This shift away from over-explaining saves an enormous amount of energy that used to go into constructing justifications for needs that should never have required justification in the first place. It also protects you from a specific vulnerability, the tendency to keep explaining and re-explaining until you talk yourself out of a boundary you knew, instinctively, that you needed. Once you stop needing to win the argument for your own peace, you become far less susceptible to being argued out of it, and that protection alone is worth the discomfort of learning to say less and mean it fully. The empath's right to rest. Somewhere in the long process of chronic overgiving, rest itself may have started to feel almost illicit, something you had to earn through sufficient productivity, sufficient caretaking, sufficient proof that you'd done enough for everyone else before you were allowed to simply stop and attend to your own needs. This distorted relationship with rest is common among people whose worth has become entangled with how much they give, how reliably they show up for others, how rarely they ask for anything in return. Part of this healing process includes reclaiming an unconditional right to rest, one that doesn't require justification through prior output, one that recognizes rest as a basic human need rather than a reward to be earned only after sufficient sacrifice. Learning to rest without guilt, to simply stop and recover without first proving you've done enough to deserve it, is one of the quieter but more significant shifts available in this process, and it extends far beyond just this one relationship into how you approach your entire life going forward. This right to rest is worth defending as fiercely as any other boundary described throughout this piece. You are not a machine designed for continuous output on behalf of other people. You are a person with real limits, real needs, and a real right to simply stop sometimes without having to account for that stopping to anyone, including yourself. Claiming this right fully is one of the more freeing outcomes of everything you've been through, and it protects you from ever again sliding into the kind of chronic depletion that characterized the chapter this piece has been describing. A note on timing. It's worth acknowledging, honestly, that everything described in this piece rarely happens according to a clean or predictable timeline. Some readers will recognize themselves in an early stage of this process, still deep in the exhausting labor of buffering, not yet at the point of stepping back that so much of this piece has been describing. Others will be well past that point, already living inside the reclaimed life this piece describes, reading these words as confirmation of a journey largely complete. Wherever you are on this timeline, none of it is a measure of your worth or your capacity for eventual healing. Healing from chronic overgiving doesn't happen on a schedule, and it certainly doesn't happen because you decide, on a particular day, that it's time to be done with it. It happens through the same accumulation of small, difficult choices described throughout this entire piece, choices that add up gradually, sometimes so gradually you don't notice the progress until you look back and realize how far you've actually traveled. If you're still early in this process, be patient with yourself. The destination described throughout this piece is real, and it's available to you too, built the same way it was built for anyone else who's ever walked this particular path, one difficult, unglamorous choice at a time. Standing at the end of this. As this piece comes to its close, it's worth returning one final time to the central truth underneath everything it's described. You were never the problem in this dynamic, and you were never responsible for fixing what was broken in someone else's capacity for consistency, accountability, or intimacy. Your empathy was never the flaw. The absence of any boundary around it was, and now, having built that boundary through real and difficult work, your empathy is protected, sustainable, and fully, finally your own to direct wherever it deserves to go. The consequences described in this piece's title were never something you needed to deliver, orchestrate, or even witness. They are simply the natural result of a pattern finally meeting the reality it had been shielded from for far too long, a reality that belongs entirely to someone else's life now, unfolding according to its own logic, no longer any of your concern to track or manage. Your task was always simpler than that, and it's already complete. You stopped absorbing what was never yours to absorb, and in doing so, you gave yourself back to yourself fully and for good. Stand here now at the end of this chapter, in the life you've built out of everything this process demanded of you. It is quieter than the one you left behind, and fuller in every way that actually matters. It is protected by boundaries you earned the hard way, populated by relationships capable of genuine reciprocity, grounded in a self-respect that will serve you for the rest of your life. This is what it means to never let an empath be broken again, not through hardness, not through withdrawal, but through the hard-won wisdom to finally, completely protect the very thing that makes you who you are. The empath's version of boundaries in daily life. It's worth translating everything described in this piece into something more concrete, the actual daily texture of what boundaries look like once they've become a genuine part of how you move through the world, rather than an abstract concept you're still working to fully embody. In practice, this might look like responding to a message the next day instead of immediately, simply because immediacy is no longer something you owe anyone by default. It might look like ending a phone call that's veering into territory that drains you, saying plainly that you need to go, without constructing an elaborate excuse to soften the exit. It might look like declining to attend an event that would require more emotional labor than you're willing to spend, without feeling obligated to provide a detailed justification for your absence. These small, daily instances of boundary setting are where the larger philosophical shifts described throughout this piece actually get tested and reinforced. It's one thing to understand intellectually that you deserve reciprocity and that your peace matters as much as anyone else's. It's another thing entirely to practice that understanding in the small, unglamorous moments of an ordinary day, when an old habit tugs at you to over-explain, over-accommodate, or overextend yourself in ways that used to feel automatic. Each time you choose the new pattern instead of the old one, even in these small daily moments, you reinforce the larger transformation this piece has been describing throughout. Over time, these small daily choices stop requiring conscious effort altogether. What once felt like a deliberate act of resistance against an old habit becomes, eventually, simply how you operate, without your having to remind yourself of the reasoning behind it each time. This is what full integration of this healing actually looks like. Not a set of rules you have to consciously apply, but a natural way of being that emerged gradually, out of enough repeated practice that it finally became who you are. When you notice how far you've come, there will likely come a moment well into this process, when something happens that would have once sent you spiraling into old patterns, an unexpected message, a piece of news about someone you used to buffer for, a situation that would have previously triggered hours of anxious management on someone else's behalf, and you notice, almost with surprise, how it actually affects you now. This noticing is worth pausing on when it happens, because it's one of the clearest, most concrete measures available of how far you've actually traveled through this entire process. These moments of noticing don't arrive on any predictable schedule, and they often catch you off guard precisely because you weren't looking for them, weren't tracking your own progress in any deliberate way, simply living your life and discovering, almost by accident, how much has genuinely changed underneath the surface. When this happens, let yourself actually register it fully rather than moving past it too quickly. You built this. Every difficult choice described throughout this piece contributed to this moment, this specific instance of remaining unmoved by something that would have once completely derailed you. Collecting these moments, even informally, even just in your own private awareness, helps reinforce the reality of your own transformation. It's easy, especially for people whose default mode has long been focused outward on other people's needs, to underestimate their own growth, to move past evidence of it without fully absorbing what it means. Don't do that here. Let yourself see clearly and repeatedly exactly how much you've changed, because that clear seeing is part of what makes the change durable, permanent, and fully, finally your own. The last word. Everything in this piece has pointed toward a single, central truth. You were never broken by loving someone who struggled to receive that love well. You were depleted by extending it without protection, without boundary, without the discernment that would have ensured it was actually being met with something in return. That depletion was real and it deserved to be taken seriously, and you took it seriously, eventually, by doing the hard, unglamorous work of building the boundaries, the discernment, and the self-respect described throughout everything above. You are not broken now. You never were, not in any permanent sense. You were simply carrying a weight that was never yours to carry, and you finally, after real difficulty, set that weight down. What remains, now that it's set down, is exactly who you always were underneath it, capable of deep love, genuine understanding, and real connection, now protected by everything this process taught you, no longer willing to disappear in order to make someone else's comfort possible. This is the final consequence, the truest one, more significant than anything that might or might not eventually happen to the person this piece's title referenced. The real consequence, the one that actually matters, is this: you got yourself back, fully, completely, and for good. And whatever comes next in your life will be built on that foundation, protected, whole, and entirely, unmistakably your own. What other empaths watching this process can learn? If you're reading this while watching someone you love go through a version of what this piece has described, whether a friend, a sibling, or someone else close to you, it's worth understanding what actually helps in that position, because the instinct to rescue someone from their own difficult process of setting boundaries can inadvertently regret. 8. The same overfunctioning pattern this piece has been describing throughout, just one step removed. The most useful thing you can offer someone going through this transformation isn't advice about exactly how or when to set a given boundary. It's steady, patient support for their own process of discovering these truths on their own timeline, at their own pace, through their own accumulation of evidence. This means resisting the urge to tell someone they should have left sooner, resisting the urge to catalog every red flag you noticed that they didn't, resisting the urge to rush their healing along faster than it's naturally unfolding. People rarely heal faster because someone else insists they should. They heal at the pace their own nervous system, their own accumulated evidence, and their own readiness allows, and the most supportive thing available to the people around them is patience, not urgency. If you recognize yourself as someone who has, at times, taken on a caretaking role even in how you support other empaths through their own difficult transformations, that recognition is worth sitting with honestly. The pattern described throughout this entire piece can show up in friendships and family relationships too, not just romantic ones, and the same principles apply everywhere it appears. Support that respects someone else's autonomy and timeline is genuinely helpful. Support that tries to manage or accelerate their process on their behalf risks becoming another version of the very dynamic this piece has spent so much time describing. The ongoing practice of choosing yourself. It's worth ending with an honest acknowledgement that everything described throughout this piece isn't a single achievement you complete once and then carry forward automatically for the rest of your life. It's an ongoing practice, one that requires periodic renewal, especially during moments of stress, loneliness, or vulnerability when old patterns tend to resurface with the most persistence. This isn't a discouraging observation. It's simply an honest one, offered so that you're not caught off guard if, months or years from now, you notice an old instinct trying to reassert itself in a new context. The good news is that this ongoing practice gets easier with repetition, the same way any skill does. The boundaries that once required significant conscious effort to maintain become, over time, more automatic, more integrated into who you simply are rather than something you have to actively choose in each individual moment. But the underlying practice, the willingness to keep choosing yourself, keep protecting your own peace, keep directing your empathy toward relationships capable of honoring it, remains an ongoing commitment rather than a one-time achievement you can set down and forget about entirely. This is, in its own way, a hopeful truth rather than a burdensome one. It means you always have the capacity to return to this practice, regardless of what challenges arise in the future, regardless of whether an old pattern occasionally tries to resurface in some new context you didn't anticipate. You've already proven you can do this hard work. That proof doesn't expire, and neither does your capacity to keep doing it again and again, for as long as your life requires it, protected by everything this experience has already taught you about exactly how it's done. A closing reflection on love itself. It's worth ending finally on the subject of love itself, since so much of this piece has necessarily focused on its absence, its imbalance, its costs when extended without protection. None of this piece has been an argument against love, against deep feeling, against the specific gift of an empath's capacity to understand and connect with other people in ways that many people simply cannot. That gift remains fully intact, everything you've been through notwithstanding, and it remains one of the most valuable things about you, worth protecting precisely because it's worth continuing to offer to the people and relationships that can actually receive it. Love, real love, the kind worth pursuing and building your life around, was never supposed to require the kind of chronic self-sacrifice this piece has spent so much time describing. It was supposed to feel, even in its difficult moments, fundamentally mutual, fundamentally safe, fundamentally sustaining rather than depleting. If what you experienced before didn't feel like that, the problem was never your capacity for love itself. It was the absence of a partner capable of meeting that capacity with anything close to equal effort. That absence doesn't diminish what you're capable of. It simply clarifies what you're now equipped to look for and what you now know with certainty you deserve to receive. Carry your capacity for love forward, protected now by everything this experience has taught you, ready to be offered fully to whoever proves capable of receiving and returning it with the same depth you're capable of giving. That love, offered wisely now rather than indiscriminately, is one of the most valuable things you have to offer anyone, and it deserves, finally, to be received by someone capable of honoring exactly how rare and valuable a gift it actually is. Where this leaves you. Where this leaves you at the end of everything described throughout this piece is not diminished, not hardened, not less capable of connection than you were before any of this began. It leaves you protected, wiser, and more fully yourself than you've perhaps ever been, carrying forward a hard-won understanding of exactly what healthy love requires and exactly what you're no longer willing to accept less than. It leaves you standing in a life built entirely on your own terms, populated by relationships capable of genuine reciprocity, grounded in boundaries that took real difficulty to build, but that now feel as natural as anything else about who you are. This is where the story actually ends, not with anyone else's consequences, not with any dramatic reckoning you need to witness or confirm, but simply with you, whole and protected and finally, completely your own. That was always the real point of everything described here, and it remains the truest, most important outcome available, not what happens to anyone else, but who you finally became in the process of protecting yourself fully, for the first time in longer than you'd probably like to admit. The version of you reading this now. Whoever you are reading this at whatever point in your own process, whether you're just beginning to recognize the patterns described throughout this piece, or whether you're well past them, already living inside the reclaimed life this piece has described, there's something worth saying directly to you before this ends. You are not too sensitive for having cared this deeply. You are not foolish for having extended patience and understanding to someone who struggled to meet you halfway. You are not weak for having stayed as long as you did, trying, hoping, believing that enough understanding might eventually be met with the consistency you deserved. And you are not hardened, cynical, or somehow less of an empath for finally, eventually, learning to protect that empathy with boundaries it should have had from the very beginning. Every part of this journey, the caring, the exhaustion, the eventual stepping back, the guilt and grief that came with it, the slow rebuilding of a life centered on your own well-being, all of it is part of a single, coherent story about someone who loved deeply, learned hard lessons, and came out the other side more whole rather than less. That story is yours, and it deserves to be told with compassion for every version of yourself who lived through each part of it, including the version who is still, right now, somewhere in the middle of it. Wherever you are in this process, keep going. The piece described throughout this piece is real, and it's available to you, built the same patient, unglamorous way it's always been built. One difficult choice at a time, one boundary held even when holding it is hard, one day at a time spent choosing yourself until choosing yourself becomes simply who you are. You are already on your way, you have been the whole time. And you will arrive in your own time at exactly the piece this entire piece has been trying to describe. One final thought before you go. If there's a single sentence worth carrying forward from everything this piece has described, let it be this. Your empathy was never the problem, and it never needed to be smaller, quieter, or more guarded in order to protect you. What needed to change was never the depth of your capacity to care. What needed to change was your willingness to extend that capacity without any boundary around it, indefinitely, to someone who wasn't meeting you with anything close to equal effort. You've made that change now, and it's permanent, built out of real difficulty, but solid enough now to hold for the rest of your life. You get to keep everything that made you an empath in the first place. The depth, the attunement, the rare and valuable capacity to understand what other people are carrying even when they can't say it themselves. None of that is gone. It's simply protected now, directed more wisely, offered to people and relationships capable of receiving it the way it deserves to be received. This is not a smaller version of who you were before. It's a fuller, more sustainable, more genuinely powerful version, built out of everything this experience taught you, ready now to carry you forward into a life that finally fully belongs to you. That is the real ending here, truer and more important than anything that might or might not happen to anyone else. You got yourself back. Fully, completely, permanently, and that is more than enough. The empath's legacy. There's one more thing worth naming before this piece truly ends, something about the longer arc of what all of this eventually means, not just for your own life, but for the example it quietly sets for anyone watching, whether that's a friend going through something similar, a younger sibling still learning what healthy relationships look like, or someday, perhaps, a child of Y. Our own who will absorb far more from what you model than from anything you ever explicitly teach. The version of you who learned to protect her empathy rather than exhaust it becomes, without any deliberate effort, a kind of living example for everyone who witnesses it, proof that deep feeling and healthy boundaries are not actually in conflict with each other, that you can be both remarkably generous and remarkably well protected at the same time. This legacy matters more than it might seem to in the moment, because so many people, especially other empaths, are still operating under the old belief that caring deeply requires accepting mistreatment indefinitely, that boundaries and compassion exist in some kind of tension that has to be constantly managed rather than genuinely resolved. Every time you demonstrate through your own lived example that this tension is false, that real compassion actually requires boundaries in order to remain sustainable, you offer something valuable to everyone around you, whether or not they ever explicitly recognize what they're learning from watching you. You don't have to think of this as a mission or a responsibility. It's simply a natural byproduct of living fully inside the transformation this piece has described, a transformation that ripples outward, quietly, into every relationship you touch, showing everyone around you what it actually looks like when an empath finally learns to love herself with the same depth and consistency she's always been willing to extend to everyone else. Where the story truly ends. And so the story ends here, not with anyone else's downfall, not with any dramatic reckoning delivered on your behalf, but with something quieter and far more durable. A person who learned through real difficulty exactly how to protect what mattered most about herself, and who now carries that protection forward into every part of her life, permanently, completely, and entirely her own. This was always the real ending worth working toward, and you've reached it, not through anything dramatic, but through the patient, unglamorous accumulation of every choice described throughout this piece, each one small on its own, together adding up to something genuinely transformative. You are here now, whole and protected, carrying forward everything this experience taught you into a life that finally, fully belongs to you. That is enough. It was always going to be enough, and it is yours now for good. A short word of encouragement for the road ahead. Whatever comes next in your life, whatever new relationships form, whatever new challenges arise that test the boundaries you've worked so hard to build, trust that you are equipped for it now in ways you weren't before this chapter began. You carry forward not just a set of lessons, but an entire embodied experience of what it takes to protect your own peace, to recognize imbalance early, to choose yourself even when choosing yourself is uncomfortable. This is not theoretical knowledge anymore. It's lived wisdom, tested under real difficulty, and it will hold up under future tests in a way that second-hand advice never could have. There will be moments inevitably when old patterns try to reassert themselves in some new context, some new relationship, some new person who reminds you in ways subtle or obvious of the dynamics this piece has spent so much time describing. When those moments arrive, you won't be starting from scratch. You'll be starting from everything you've already built, everything you've already proven about your own capacity to recognize, name, and step back from patterns that don't serve you. That foundation makes every future challenge easier to navigate than this one was, not because future challenges will be simple, but because you'll be meeting them with tools you didn't have before. Trust yourself. Trust the boundaries you've built, trust the discernment you've developed, the self-respect you've reclaimed, the quiet confidence that comes from having already survived something genuinely difficult and emerged from it stronger rather than diminished. You are ready for whatever comes next, not because life will stop presenting challenges, but because you now know, with certainty born of direct experience, exactly what you're capable of when those challenges arrive. This is where this piece finally, truly ends, not with a warning, not with a prediction about anyone else's future, but with a simple, steady confidence in yours. You built something real here. Carry it forward fully and without hesitation into everything that comes next. Last lines. If nothing else from this piece stays with you, let these final words remain. You were never too much for loving deeply, and you were never wrong for wanting reciprocity in return. What you needed was never less capacity for empathy. What you needed was better protection around it, and you built that protection patiently and thoroughly through everything described across every section of this piece. That protection is yours now, permanently, ready to hold whatever comes next in your life, ensuring that your remarkable capacity for love, understanding, and connection remains a gift you can offer freely for the rest of your life without ever again paying for it at the cost of yourself. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were simply carrying weight that was never yours, and you finally, after real and difficult work, set it down. What remains is exactly who you always were, whole, capable, and deeply worthy of love that meets you halfway. Carry that forward. It is, in the end, the entire point of everything this piece has tried to say. A final note on beginning again. Every ending described throughout this piece is also, quietly, a beginning, the start of a life built more honestly, more sustainably, and more fully around who you actually are rather than around who someone else needed you to be in order to feel comfortable. That beginning doesn't require fanfare or dramatic declaration. It simply requires the same thing every part of this transformation has required all along, continuing to choose yourself, one ordinary day at a time, until that choosing becomes so natural you forget it was ever difficult at all. You are standing at that beginning now, equipped with everything this piece has described, ready to build whatever comes next on a foundation that finally fully belongs to you. That is not a small thing. It is in fact everything, and it is yours completely and for good. Closing word. This is where the piece rests, finally, in the quiet certainty of a story completed on its own terms. You loved fully, you learned hard lessons, and you protected yourself permanently in a way that will serve every chapter of your life that comes after this one. That protection was always the real consequence worth caring about, more important than anything that might or might not eventually happen to anyone else, and it belongs to you now completely for as long as you choose to keep it. This is enough. It was always going to be enough, and it is yours. Nothing more needs to be said. The work is done, and it was worth every bit of what it took. You are whole, you are protected, you are at last entirely your own. That is the truest ending this story could ever have. The rest of your life is waiting, unshadowed and entirely open, ready for you to walk into it exactly as you are. Go live it fully, protected and whole, exactly as you now know how.